And joining us now on the debate, Dr. Charles Tatter, professor of neurosurgery at the University of Toronto and the founder of Think First. Ken Dryden, member of Parliament for York Centre and Hall of Fame NHL goaltender. Mary Ormsby, reporter at the Toronto Star, and Sean McIndoe, hockey blogger at the blog Down Goes Brown. And you call it Down Goes Brown because?
Because of a fight that happened almost 20 years ago.
All right, so you're the guy we need for this debate for sure. Look, I know we've all seen this footage before, but we're going to show it again because this is what we're talking about tonight. Sidney Crosby and, well, Max Pacioretty. Roll tape, please.
The blind side. Let's watch 39.
He's looking for the puck.
He's trying to just getting into position. Did he turn, get hit?
Oh, yeah. Never. Steckel got it.
On the Montreal bench as Pacioretty tries to get up in the air, and not a dirty hit by Zdeno Chara, just trying to finish him, and it's just Pacioretty trying to reach for a puck. Zdeno Chara leans on him, and he just takes it right in his head. A lot of force moving into a stanchion. Dr. Mulder out there.
What amazes me is how often, no doubt, we have all watched that footage, and yet I still hear gasps at the table when we've played it for probably what is the 50th viewing. Let's analyze these one by one. The Washington-Pittsburgh game. Mary, what happened?
A dirty blindside.
You think it was dirty?
I think it was dirty. There was time to line him up, so there was time to get out of his way.
Ken, dirty hit?
Yeah, and I mean, it looked like a minor hit. I mean, you've seen people get hit a lot harder than that, but he didn't see it coming, and he got hit sort of on the angle of it.
Sean?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think he
dirty
knew.
And intentional.
Well, I think it was intentional. I mean, we're in this kind of weird area in the NHL where dirty means different things to different people, and some people would say that intentionally hitting a guy, if you can make it look like it wasn't intentional, maybe that's not all that dirty. I mean, the NHL didn't think it was dirty. He didn't get suspended for it. Right. But no, I have a hard time believing that anytime you're on the ice with Sidney Crosby that you don't know where Crosby is.
Charles Tatter?
I think it was intentional and almost premeditated, because you have to really get your shoulder lined up with the opponent's head to knock somebody down like that.
The effect was obviously terrible for Crosby. He's still not playing, right? He's finally back on skates after 2.5 months, but he hasn't laced up yet to actually play for Pittsburgh. And yet the commentator, as the footage was being replayed on the night of, Ken, said, looks like he, brushed by him on his way up the ice, not intentional. Nobody seems to be saying it the way you guys are saying it tonight. How come?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, a commentator, and it wasn't part of the action at that moment. I mean, the puck was somewhere else, and so what you saw, and you could hear the commentator's reaction of surprise in hearing or seeing it on the replay, and so they weren't expecting to see what they really saw, and because it wasn't a thunderous hit, I think that they thought that that it was probably unintentional. But I think that's probably why the reaction at that time.
Mary, let's go to the second game, the Boston-Montreal game.
Right.
Zdeno Chara on Max Pacioretty. Your view again, what happened?
Well, I know when I saw it, there was complete dread. I thought Pacioretty was dead. But in real time, we see that hit often in slow motion. In real time, Chara's moving so fast and so powerful. I'm just not sure it was a dirty, premeditated hit. I'm not sure.
And Chara's 6'9", 260.
Yes.
So when a guy that big
he could have killed him. Yes.
Ken, what did you see in that footage?
Yeah, same. I mean, I couldn't believe the replay and of how it was like running with your head face first into a brick wall. I mean, I couldn't believe the force of it, and I thought he was dead too. And I didn't see the replay, I didn't see the footage until 2 days later. And I think, though, as Mayor, what Chara did wrong, but which is not wrong by the NHL, is that he carried on the hit after Pacioretty had given up the puck. Now, I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that afterwards. But I don't think that he intentionally tried to plaster him against the boards. I don't think that he was aware of where the stanchion was and was looking to deliver damage that way. You know, the Chara that I know of, and we can all do wrong things even if you're a fair guy. Chara is a pretty fair guy, and as you mentioned, I mean, he is big enough to really destroy people if he really wants to, and I don't think that that's what happened here.
Charles Satter, what did you see in that footage?
Well, I think big players have to have even greater respect for their own bodies and for the bodies of the opponents. So they have to know where that huge hulking body is in relationship to the opponent's parts. And I think it's premeditated and intentional. And if you saw the follow through, I've watched this several times, Chara's left arm finishes off with a blow to the head of Pacioretty. There's an arm that goes right to Pacioretty's head. So I don't see how you can call that quote unquote accidental.
Well, in hockey, that's sometimes called completing your check. And what you seem to be...
Not to the head, though.
Okay, but what you seem to be saying is that Chara was aware enough of his circumstances that he purposefully pushed Pacioretty's face into that stanchion.
Purposely. His arm finishes it off against Pacioretty's head. So how could he get his arm up that high, even though he's so huge? He still had to have his arm up, and if you look at that, you'll see his arm against Pacioretty's head. So that's intentional, illegal, damaging play.
Sean, what'd you see?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not like the Crosby hit where you've got a defense of, you know, it was accidental, I didn't even know he was there. I mean, in this case, Chara is clearly initiating the contact. Mm-hmm. In fact, he's initiating contact after the puck is gone. He got an interference penalty. So it's not a clean hit in the sense that he didn't break any rules.
What did he get? He got more interference, didn't
well,
he?
He got an interference penalty,
5 minutes,
which became 5 minutes because of the injury, because it's an automatic major if there's an injury, and obviously in that case there was. So, you know, he knew what he was doing as far as physically taking a guy out of the play and not wanting a guy to beat him and maybe go down the ice on a 2-on-1. Whether he knew where the stanchion was, you know, I don't know. And that's what I hate about so many of these hits, is that it puts us in the business of trying to read minds.
Ken, as far as the league was concerned, neither of those hits, which resulted in profound damage to Crosby and Pacioretty, resulted in further punishment from the league. There were no additional suspensions. Is that the right call?
No. Well, I think that the Pacioretty one is not the best example of what the problem is. I think the Crosby one is much closer to it, and there are lots of other Crosby-like hits. I think that there's lots of discussion and distracting debate over the Pacioretty one. I think that what is undeniable is the impact on the future of those players in terms of the head injuries. And I think that's the key part of it. I mean, one of the things that the NHL gets into trouble with is that you're defining legal hits and not legal hits, as opposed to significant damage versus non-significant damage. Right. And at a certain point, if something continuously generates damage but is called a legal hit, that's not the right designation for it. I mean, you start changing the rules to make something illegal if it routinely generates the kind of damage that is happening.
The league has chosen not to do that this week.
The league has chosen not to do it, and the part that that really, the first day's announcements of Gary Bettman. So he talks about the doctors and playing a bigger role, makes sense. Talks about looking at equipment, makes sense. Talks about, there was one other the arenas and the safety of the arenas. Nothing about the on ice. So then the next day the general managers talk about the on ice. They come back with saying, well, call the penalties. There's boarding, there's charging. It misses the point entirely. I mean, the reason why referees don't call charging anymore is because the game is played at a charging pace.
This is where you take 2 or 3 steps to take a run at a guy.
2 or 3 steps, yeah. And now it's routinely 15 or 20 steps because players are playing at full speed all the time. And that's what you're going to have to really take a look at.
We are going to come back to this, but I want to go to the good doctor here first to do a little, medicine 101 here on what happens to the brain when it gets concussed. We have seen a lot of concussions during the course of National Hockey League games this year. The league would suggest not through any nefariousness or dirty play, but often just through the way the game is played. So tell us, what happens to your brain when you get a concussion?
Well, what happens to the brain is a jiggle. In other words, there's movement of the brain within the skull. If my hand here is the skull and the other hand is the brain moves within the skull. And it's thought to be the rotatory movement or angular acceleration, as the biomechanical engineers call it, that actually causes concussion. So it's the jiggle of the brain in the skull.
Does the brain get bruised as a result of hitting the skull?
We don't see bruises. And on MRI studies, we can be so accurate nowadays. Bruises do show up. But if you do an MRI on the usual concussion, we don't see anything.
How long can a typical concussion, the symptoms thereof, last?
Some people get over a concussion within a few minutes. So I see a lot of people who have a concussion. Some of them are over it, especially if it's the first concussion. But as the number builds up, the length of time needed to recover increases, so that, in fact, the recovery time can stretch on to months or even never if it's like the fifth or sixth concussion.
And the symptoms are?
Well, the symptoms of concussion are quite huge. There's a long list. Most people do get some headaches, some dizziness, perhaps some disorientation, or there may be frank unconsciousness, although that's rare. About 95% of concussions occur without any loss of consciousness.
Mary, I think, you two said it today, that when you saw the Pacioretty hit, you thought he was dead. He actually got out of hospital 2 days after that. Do you know how he is now? How's he doing?
I don't know how he is now.
He's, it's, for a guy who had busted vertebrae, though, it's shocking to me that he would be out that quickly. Let me follow up with this. The PM has weighed in. Air Canada has weighed in. Via Rail has weighed in. Sponsors are spooked. Ken Dryden felt concerned enough about this to write an op-ed piece in the Globe and Mail about this. Why does the outcry very much more recently appear to be so much stronger than anything we've seen in the past?
I think we've probably finally hit critical mass in the mainstream public because, as Dr. Tatter knows, there has been traction in the scientific world for several years of a growing body of evidence that pro sports bodies, the NFL included, and the NHL have chosen to be very cavalier about the science and said, phooey, Dr. Tatter, your science is voodoo science and we know better, it's not hurting our game at all. So I think the public is a little more sensitive about what's out there in the science world. So logically, they're worried about health of athletes. And let's face it, pros are only a very small top of the pyramid. Most of the hockey played in this country is youth hockey, and that's our children, our kids. So they are being affected too, down the food chain, but they can be concussed as easily as the pros. So I think a lot of things are in play here. That big hit, very dramatic, very emotional, and with the Prime Minister of a country saying, hey, fellas, you've got to do something before someone's dead. I mean, if you don't want to redefine what you think is an acceptable risk in hockey, do you really accept the possibility of death? Is that okay? So I think people are very emotional right now, and they're much more emotional about it than when Sidney Crosby went down in January. He was the greatest player in the game at the moment, I believe. But this has really hit home, and it doesn't really matter why. It's good that it's out there because now people are maybe acting and maybe more open to listening to what the medical people are telling us.
Sean, why do you think there's so much more sensitivity about this now?
Well, it's just, it was really the perfect timing as far as driving the public to finally look at this. I mean, there were a few factors. First of all, the fact that it happened in Montreal is a factor, between Montreal and Boston, this historic rivalry. If it had happened in a game between Atlanta and the Islanders, maybe we're not talking about it today. But you also look at the timing of some of the other events. I mean, first of all, Sidney Crosby's injury happened in January, but at the time we were told that he was going to be okay. And in fact, he played in the next game and got hit again. Then he went out, but it was only supposed to be a few days and then maybe a few weeks. And it was sort of, this happens at the same time fans are going, man, Crosby is still not back. Plus, then you also had the news coming out about Bob Probert. It just felt like as a fan, you're getting hit from all different angles on this story. And, there's a certain, as a fan, to be real honest with you, there's a built-in desire to just sort of ignore this and hope it goes away and hope we can go back to watching hockey like we used to. But when you hear it enough times and from enough different angles, you just can't anymore. And that's when you say, okay, we got to have the discussion and something has to change.
Ken, I'm going to assume that you get asked all the time to comment on what's going on in the National Hockey League, and my bet is that most of the time you say, I'm in politics now, I'm not a hockey player anymore, and I'll take a pass. But you had a big piece in the Globe and Mail this past weekend. So something obviously has changed to get you to take fingers to typewriter and do something, or I guess fingers to keyboard, let's say nowadays, to do something. What's different?
I think it is. I think it's just as Sean and Mary said, is part of it. I think it's also football and some of the injuries that have happened in football, the suicide of Dave Duerson, the Chicago Bears player who was 50 years old and working with the NFL Players Association and was seeing the impact on some of the former players, and then did the sort of the remarkable suicide gesture of, instead of shooting himself in the head, he shot himself in the chest in order then to allow his brain to be studied. And some of the stories in the last while of the wives of former players. And they are going to be a force to be reckoned with in the future as they see their husbands go into show symptoms of premature dementia at earlier ages. And then I think the other part of it is that, and as I said in the article, I mean, when we look at various things in society of how smoking, was something that we kind of accepted for a very long period of time, or the absence of rights for women, or of segregation, or slavery, and we look back at those times and say, what could they have been thinking? How could they have been so stupid? And knowing that 50 years from now, people are going to be looking back on us and saying the same thing about something or a number of things. What are those things? And I think in sports, it's going to be head injuries.
Head injuries, and I'll get more specific in asking you this, Dr. Tatter, fighting. Because you just mentioned Bob Probert, and Bob Probert probably had 300-400 fights in his National Hockey League career, died at 45, and his brain was a mess. They looked at his brain afterwards at Boston University, and his brain was a mess. Does the NHL have to ban fighting in order to protect players from bashing each other's brains in, and I mean that literally now?
Well, I think that the NHL should ban fighting because fighting is an identifiable cause of concussion, that many players do actually get concussed as a result of fights. Fights doesn't rank as high, in fact, as shoulders to the head or elbows to the head, or hits from behind as a cause of concussion, but fighting causes probably about 8% of concussion, so it's not huge. But I believe that it should be eliminated. It would make a better game without fighting, and it would save brains.
Well, says you, but I don't notice anybody going to the snack bar when two guys drop the gloves in a game, Sean, so I think the people who go to games don't mind fighting.
Yeah,
that's
well,
fair to say.
I mean, it's certainly not unanimous, but yeah, I think it's quite clear that the majority of people who would identify themselves as hockey fans either enjoy the fighting and would actively like to see it, or at least accept it as part of the game. Now, I'm one of those guys. I mean, I grew up as a Don Cherry fan, and I had all the Rock'em Sock'em videos, and got one every Christmas and watched it, and still do to this day. I'll go back and watch the highlights on YouTube. If someone sends me a clip of a fight from 1989 on YouTube, my afternoon's done because I'm going to be clicking through the next video through the whole way. But I will say that if we had been having this discussion 2 years ago, I probably would have been the guy sitting on this panel saying, you know what, as a fan, you will never turn me off fighting. You will never have me say that we need to move. But as we're starting to learn this stuff, maybe.
Maybe. Ken Dryden.
I'm just not sure that this is the time to rekindle the debate on fighting. I think that if this distracts over into the debate on fighting, it'll end up the way pretty much every debate on fighting goes and nothing really happens.
Inconclusive.
I think this is the opportunity to really focus in on what the problem is. And as Dr. Tatter said, fighting generates 8% of these kinds of problems. It is in the rest of the game and with lots of non-fighters where the damage is done. And I would not like to see the discussion hijacked again by a fighting debate.
As usual, I'm going to follow Ken Dryden's advice, and I'm going to get away from fighting and go to something else. And Mary, I want you to talk to me about this. Here's from John McKinnon, who's an Edmonton writer, and the head is published in the Vancouver Sun last month. Based on preliminary data, blindside hits are down this year over last year. So says NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman. Any increase in concussions this year can be attributed to other factors. Teammates colliding accidentally, players tripping and falling and cracking their head on the ice or the boards or the glass, players being struck by the puck, and on and on. The NHL sees Crosby's concussion as a result of such an accidental collision, which is either, he says, a crock or a reasonable explanation, depending on your point of view. Okay, which is it?
Croc comes to mind.
Something stronger comes to mind?
That phooey voodoo science. Maybe I'd like to know about those stats a little more closely. To me, that just really touches on the reluctance to come to terms with any kind of prevention. If the NHL says their statistics are correct, a lot of their concussions are caused by other things that aren't violent. Well, first of all, I don't. If that's the case, then they've got a problem with the other things happening. But in general, I just think it's a cultural shift that they have to get into, whether it's fighting or better teaching of what's appropriate. And it's not just at the NHL level. I keep sort of pushing on this because I'm a parent with kids in hockey too. It's way down at the grassroots level as well. And I'll tell you this, 2 of my sons were in fights this year, and I'm not proud of that because I think fighting should be out of the game. One boy got, he's 12, he got a 3-game suspension. The other boy got 2 and a 10 and was allowed to finish the game. So when we talk about fighting and the culture of hitting and no respect for the other person's head or body, it's in there with the little kids too. It's not just the big kids. So it comes to not just the leadership at the pro and semi-pro level and the junior level. By the way, Paul Eklund out of London area, he did a study, and according to his junior study, concussions were represented by 24% of them were with fights. So the NHL and junior hockey, a little different, right? So stats or however you want to spin them. So I just think it's a cultural shift. We're not quite there yet. And as long as the NHL wants to go on a case by case by case by case basis, all in a little silo, they're never going to get the traction to do anything big, which is prevention. They talk about doing things after the hit. The doctor takes you away in a warm room, puts incense on or something, rubs your feet. Are you good? Are you good? The problem is before the hit.
Well, let me follow up with Ken on that, because when you played the game, I think very few players wore helmets. The equipment was not made out of concrete. It was made out of soft leather. Did guys get hurt as much?
No, not as often. The biggest change to me is in the length of the shifts that the players play. If you went back to the 1950s, and I did this when I was writing an earlier book, and got full game tapes, not highlights, full game and with a stopwatch. And I would time players how long they'd be on the ice. And on average, they'd be on the ice about 2 minutes. And they'd start to look for a way off at about 1:40, and they might make it in time, they might not. Henri Richard was on the ice over 3 minutes every time. If you went into the 70s, it was around a minute. And if you play that length of time on the ice, the game that you play is coasting and then bursting. You burst an offensive chance, you burst back if you've got a defensive problem, but that's the nature of it. Now the shift is 35 seconds long. The message to the player is the moment you're on the ice, full bore. It is a full sprint from then until you go off the ice 35 seconds later. You have players that are on average probably 20 pounds heavier. You have, as you describe, equipment that is not only more protective for you, but is more damaging to somebody else because it's harder equipment. you have the force of those collisions so much greater than before. And that's the part that really bothers me. I mean, it's in the routine game. I mentioned earlier about the NHL and charging and boarding. I mean, charging used to be something that you could see really easily because players were far enough away from each other and you'd take the extra step to really hit somebody. Now, because it's full speed all the time, you can't tell whether anybody is speeding up. That's why the referees haven't been calling it, but the force of the impact is still the same or greater.
Well, let me go to Sean with this, and at the risk of saying something heretical here, however, the game's way more entertaining today, I think, than it was 40 years ago or 50 years ago. The guys are way faster. The game is played at lightning speed. Isn't it a better game today?
Well, I don't know that it's a better game today, to be honest. I mean, I can't go back to the 60s and 70s.
No, but when you look at the highlights of those games, I mean, those games look like they were played in molasses compared to the game today.
They do, and the other thing is that the game today is so...
You know what I'm saying?
And I'll agree with this as soon as Sean's finished.
Yeah, I mean, the game today, it's played, and Ken's exactly right, the speed and the shifts, but it's also, it's so well coached. Everybody knows where to be at all times. There's nobody out there who's freelancing. There's nobody out there who is, drifting around, looking for an opening somewhere. Everybody has their assignment. Everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to do. And part of what that's contributed to is we see lower scoring. We don't see the offense we saw in the 80s or the first half of the 90s. So that contributes to less entertainment. But from a physical side, you're right. I mean, these guys are going so fast, and they're so much bigger too. I mean, I remember
the ice is the same size.
And the ice is the same size. I saw something on the Pacioretty hit where somebody made a reference to him saying, "Well, I mean, this is what's going to happen when somebody small goes up against Zdeno Chara." Pacioretty is 6'2" and 215 pounds. He's bigger than Mark Messier was. He's the same size as Cam Neely and Scott Stevens. I mean, these guys were monsters, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and now, if that is small now, then, we've seen a massive change that, that we really didn't even notice as it was happening.
Want to follow up?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that hockey is a more exciting game than it was, and it is, it is lightning fast, and anybody who ever is inside an arena, and if you ever have the chance to be in the first 10 rows, you will not believe how fast it goes, how big they are, how little space, how little time there is for anything. But the challenge then is, okay, if that's what's in us, how do we adapt the game to also make it safer? And I think that one of the ways in which you can slow it down to a little bit, to make it constructive, is in terms of that notion of finishing your check. I mean, that didn't exist. That phrase didn't exist in the 1950s because the players were far enough away from each other that you couldn't finish your check. That is something that evolved as players moved faster, got closer to each other, and every other time on the ice, when you hit somebody who doesn't have the puck, that's interference. It should be just as much interference if you hit somebody after they've released the puck, as Pacioretty had done there. And if Zdeno Chara knew that if he, continued through to finish his check, that he would be vulnerable to an interference penalty, and he got it at that particular moment, but almost every other time they don't call that penalty,
right,
then he would have to be in control of his speed. He would go into the hit at 15 miles an hour rather than 22 miles an hour.
Makes sense. Can I, Dr. Tatter, ask you about something that Stephen Brunt wrote in the Globe and Mail? He's a pretty good columnist, eh?
He's okay.
He's okay.
Yeah.
He said, the NHL in part is in the violence business, which means it is willing to accept significant risks to the health of its players. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think that's the track record. That for me, the hit on Crosby, his concussions are the tipping point, and things have changed because of that. And I think that the NHL is taking better cognizance of the issue, the way the NFL did when they reached their tipping point. And I think we can look forward to a better game because of that. I think the pro game now has actually suffered, and I think that they're turning off people. They're turning off the children, the youths from the game. They're turning off the parents. And I think that is the real danger of allowing this game to go on the way it has been.
I just saw a Navigator poll before coming on the air saying 25% of the people surveyed would watch less hockey out of disgust with what they've been seeing over the last couple of months. Mary, what about that? Do you see a professional league prepared to sacrifice the health of its players on the altar of violence sells?
It's happening now, so I would say, why wouldn't it continue? And I'll tell you one thing we haven't even touched on here is the players themselves. They have a union, they have a voice. They choose, I would say, not to use that power and that clout. There's little bits here and there, but the players don't, and Ken may or may not agree with me on this one, but I don't really see them taking the lead in all this. It's supposed to be a collective process, and I know when Pacioretty goes down, the union is looking after his interests. That union also has to look after Zdeno Chara. Mm-hmm. You know, there are two players here at risk, and the union, I see, year after year, does not stand up and say, we could really make this safer if we pushed. And I don't see the push, and I think that's because there's a conceit of a generation. I'm good. You know, if your team is averaging 1 or 2 concussions per team, and you're not one of them, you're one of the 20 guys who's okay, what do you really care?
I'm all right, Jack.
I'm all right. And maybe that, because, you know, careers are short. And you want to just run as hard as you can, and you don't want anything. If you're really good at finishing your check, you don't want someone coming in and saying, no more finishing your check. You know, because then you're not valuable to your team. So there is something there. There's a responsibility, I think, and an accountability for the players to come forward as well. And whatever bar they set, they're saying things in the press now, but, you know, but when the time really comes, will they stand up and be counted and make a difference?
Let me get Ken and Sean on this as well.
What I've found surprising in the last 6 months or so is the players are saying more than they have ever said before. I mean, as Mary has mentioned, players say next to nothing about issues and questions like this. When there's a debate about fighting, never. There's never a voice of a player. There are more and more players, and you see the little clips of the interviews in dressing rooms after practice or after a game. There are more players. I mean, I remember it was Daniel Sedin, Joe Thornton, and a number of others that I didn't notice who, in fact, they were. They're starting to talk about head injuries in a way in which they've never talked about fighting before. And you also know what is going to start to happen is their, you know, wives, partners, girlfriends, mothers, fathers, they are starting to talk into their ear. Their agents are going to start to, you know, come forward. Lawyers are going to start to get into the action in all of this. So I think this is a different one. I think on fighting, players don't say anything. I think on this one they're starting to.
Sean.
I hope that he's right. And you know, so far we have seen some individual players step up, but it's still the individual players. It's not the union stepping forward and saying enough is enough. And what I really hope happens is that the union and the league stop treating player safety like it's a bargaining issue. Like it's just one more bargaining chip when you sit down to work on a new CBA, that the players say, hey, could you maybe do something to keep us from getting head injuries? And the league says, well, you have to give us this. And the players say, well, maybe that's too much. And then you go on and negotiate something else. Separate it out, sit down, get everyone together, because it's in everyone's best interest. And nobody wins when Sidney Crosby is on the sidelines for 3 months.
That's for sure.
So, you know, get it away from the rest of the bargaining, put it aside, sit down and figure it out, because you should both be on the same side on it.
Charles Tatter, have players talked to you candidly, privately, about their feelings on this?
Yeah, I see a lot of players, both amateur and professional. The ones that really get to me the most are the young people, like a 13-year-old who's already had 3 concussions, and it's now 9 months from his last concussion, and he still can't do his schoolwork properly. He's still sensitive to light and to sound, and he's overly fatigued, so he's carrying all the symptoms of his post-concussion syndrome. And then I see professionals too who've had their careers ended. Like it's terrible to have to not be able to go back to what you love to do. And you know, professionals they just love the game and they're talented, and you just, you know, feel so badly for them when you have to say, look, you've damaged your brain, and you have to quit.
Ken, our last 30 seconds, let me give it to you. We supposedly in this country love this game almost as much as we love anything. Do we love it a little less now, given what we've seen this year?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that the dimension of the reaction is out of a love for something. I think, you know, we love hockey. We love that game that is on the ice. It is a terrific game. It is getting better, and it can be played in a way that is safer and smarter and be just as exciting, just as compelling as it is right now. I think this reaction is out of love rather than dismissing it.
Okay. I want to thank all of you for coming in today and helping us with this discussion. Ken Dryden, the MP from York Centre, former NHL great. Mary Ormsby, the Toronto Star, the sports reporter there. And on the other side of the table, Dr. Charles Tatter, professor of neurosurgery at U of T, and Sean McIndoe, hockey blogger at Down Goes Brown. Thanks so much, everybody.